Hello there, this is a 13th century schizoid man with another video, and here I'm outside Clifford's Tower.
York Castle, also known as Clifford's Tower, is an interesting building. It has seen everything from fires to explosions. It's even been a prison, as well as a garrison. So, without further ado, let's get stuck into the history of York Castle. Unlike many castles, and despite York's rich history, what became York Castle was never built on any old Roman ruins that we know of, or pre-existing structure. Instead, it was built during the Norman conquest. Following his victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, William the Conqueror needed to fortify his newly wrested kingdom. Thus, a series of castles were built in strategic areas. But York was considered safe from the invading Normans. The city itself had ceased being a Viking capital and was now run by a Saxon called Morcar, the Earl of York. Morcar and his brother Edwin have only just given the Vikings a shoeing at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, only to hear that King Harold had been slain at Hastings. Initially, Edwin and Morcar pushed back against the Norman war machine, electing Edgar the Atheling as king, but resistance was futile. By 1068, the Conqueror had reached York, as his armies swiftly dominated the north, putting down rebellion after rebellion. To deal with this, King William builds a motte and bailey castle between the River Foss and the River Ouse. This is known as York Castle. Just like Cardiff Castle, York's had its origins as a wooden affair, and just like any other castle, it was a show of strength, housing a garrison and keeping the locals subdued. For its time, it was quite the structure, and many dwellings were levelled just to make space for the foundations. The High Sheriff of Yorkshire was a knight named William Mallet, and he was placed in charge of this massive fortification, using it to put down another rebellion, and a second castle was also built on Bell Hill, though little remains of this structure, just the motte and a tower that leads to the city walls. Now, the Earl of Northumbria was Gospatrick, but he allies with a host of Danes who sail up the River Ouse, sacking the place and attacking the newly built castles. The ensuing fire ends up burning down the local cathedral, York Minster. During this raid, William Mallet is taken captives by said Danes. King William is not happy. He's as happy as this bunny. And once the Vikings have been sent packing, he replaces Gospatrick with Wulftheof, the Earl of Northampton, now the Earl of Northumbria, and Gospatrick is sent into exile. Unfortunately for the people of Northumbria, this rebellion would be the last straw for the Conqueror. In 1069, he'd had enough and took his armies to York, laying the north to waste. For a year, William ravaged the lands, sparing neither woman nor child. Villages burned, and innocents were slain alongside the guilty. Even the animals and crop were destroyed in this scorched earth tactic, designed as a deterrent for all future rebellions. The harrying of the North will always be a blight on the pages of history. It's even been classed as a genocide, a dark stain on the Williams' already brutally cruel record. As the North burned, the castles were reinforced as extensive damage had been inflicted during the rebellion. The castle itself was already highly defensible, boasting a huge moat, but I'll go into more detail about that, as it's not your usual affair. Initially, the palisades around York Castle, the outer palisades, were protected by a ditch that ran the perimeter. Now, a dam was constructed with the intention of flooding this ditch, creating a wet moat. Very impressive. Unfortunately, the dam also flooded the Foss Valley, creating an artificial lake, and this is dubbed the King's Pool, or King's Fish Pool. This picture sums up perfectly the wet moat, along with the outer palisade and the keep atop the moat. When people hear the word castle, these stone affairs immediately spring to mind, but it wasn't always the case, as we can see here. Especially around these times, they were built out of wood. Around 1070, William Mallet is no longer High Sheriff. That title belongs to Hugh Fitzbaldrick. But Hugh doesn't appear to be residing at the castle. In fact, we cannot really use the sheriffs as a guideline, as they didn't really spend much time at the castle at all. They live elsewhere, often in other parts of the country, as they held multiple domains. Even Ralph Paynell is only mentioned as being in York on a number of occasions. The same goes for the Earls of Northumbria, who control the region. So, unlike Cardiff Castle, where I explained the various nobles who controlled affairs there, here the castle belongs to the crown, meaning instead of a list of lords and earls, it is the monarch who runs the place, for the most part at least. Thus, the castle passes from William the Conqueror to his son, William Rufus. But he died in a tragic hunting accident. Incidentally, the eldest brother, Richard, had also died in a tragic hunting accident. Either this family was extremely bad at hunting, or something dodgy was going on. Anyway, so with his older brother Robert imprisoned in Cardiff Castle, the younger brother Henry seizes the throne, becoming Henry I. We're now in the 12th century, by the way, the age of chivalry. When Henry I dies, the anarchy erupts all over the kingdom. A war of succession between Stephen and Matilda. During this period, David I of Scotland has allied with Empress Matilda and invades the north of England. William le Gros is sent north against the Scottish invaders and wins a stunning victory in nearby Northallerton at the Battle of the Standard. After this, the title of Earl of York is created by King Stephen, and William le Gros is given the honour of receiving it. He's in charge of the castle, and is only in charge of the castle. The building itself still belongs to the king. Eventually, Matilda's son, Henry, takes the throne as Henry II, and the earldom is annulled. But in this age, it's still an old wooden fort situated on a hill, built almost 100 years prior. A far cry from what we see today. Still, Henry had plans for the castle and conducted many repairs to the still wooden keep. When the King of Scotland, William the Lion, pays homage to the English king, the meeting place is in York, and they both stayed at the castle. And the king visited here about 4 times during his reign, staying in the keep every time. He even built mills to support the garrison there, because mills are a good source of income. He handed the rights to them to the Knights Templar. Next king, Richard the Lionheart, did resurrect the position of Earl of York. However, he gave it to a German aristocrat called Otto, who probably only came to York about once. Eventually, Otto would become the Holy Roman Emperor, and the title of York, he keeps it until his death, where it is never used again. On a more sombre note, in 1190 there was an atrocious pogrom aimed at the Jewish community, sparked by King Richard's vow to go on crusade. There was already anti-Semitism going on in England around this time, despite the Jews being under the protection of the king. Tensions broke out in York, and the Jews were violently attacked. Joseph of York, the community leader, led the fleeing Jews to the castle, where they took refuge in the keep. A local mob surrounded it, escalating the problem, and when the constable of the garrison heads outside to negotiate, the Jews panic and shut the gate behind him, locking themselves in the keep. The result is a siege laid by the sheriff. The Jews feared they were doomed, and rather being slain by the mob or starved in a siege, the Jews made the last pact and chose collectively to end their lives. Gruesome fate, and lacking any poisons, they had to use knives to slay each other, killing the women and the children first, and then the keep was set on fire. 150 Jewish corpses burnt in the inferno. Some Jews did surrender prior to this. They even converted to Christianity, and were still murdered by the crowd. There really was no way out. Another dark day. The keep was rebuilt after this, again out of wood. Already, it's like the ship of Theseus. Is it even the same castle now? And I wouldn't be surprised if this is what got dubbed the High Tower, as this new build was around 13 feet taller. It was King John who probably used York Castle the most, using it as his private quarters while in the north. So the keep had to be kept in perfect condition, constantly maintained. The garrison getting a boost, with a retinue of knights and crossbowmen. You also find references to prisoners being housed here, captured during John's Irish campaigns, and keeping prisoners here is a trend that would continue right up until the 20th century, and many executions would take place at the Bailey over the centuries that passed. But I think we've dealt enough with the Ship of Theseus version of the wooden castle. It is not what we see today, and at some time the old fort was pulled down and replaced. This happens in the reign of Henry III, another king who loved York Castle, holding several Christmas feasts here, among other things. One such Christmas in 1228, there was a terrible storm that ripped through the high tower. forcing the king and his retinue to seek refuge in the bailey. Henry didn't bother with repairing the keep and let it fall to ruin, using the much better suited bailey instead. And it wouldn't be until 1245 when Henry, who was undergoing many building projects during this time, decided to rebuild the keep in response to growing aggression from Scotland in the year before. Henry was already building a nice lavish palace at Windsor Castle, and he hired the master mason there to design the New York castle. So now we're seeing the four-towered keep we know today, a multi-storey grand affair worthy of the 13th century. And this new keep is dubbed the King's Tower, built by a king for a king, Henry's own northern retreat. After all, the castle is controlled and owned by the crown. You would have gained entrance through a gatehouse, flanked most likely by guardrooms, and that led directly into the inner keep. There was no mistaking that this was a royal residence. And we're looking at the gutted interior. It wasn't like this when it was built. Ignoring the metal modern walkways, you can see the fixtures in the walls. That would have housed wooden beams, completing the structure. There would have been wooden panels, creating divisions for various points on the ground floor, illuminated by the lights of many candles, as well as the windows you can see here. We can no longer see these screens, these divisions, having been long lost to the pages of time. But you can see where they begin. We just don't know their function or their purpose. We don't know the layout of the tables, the chairs, or other furniture that would have been seen here. But a fireplace does indicate a large space to give warmth to the castle, the lower floor anyway, especially in the winter. Something was certainly housed in these fittings, leading to one of the windows. A screen, perhaps? A part of some stairs leading up? Something else? That's the thing with castles. For the most part, we can only guess as to what went where. This window, though, certainly looks like it was designed for military use. An arrow slit, probably accessed by a platform given the angle, and having alterations over the years. And it wasn't the only one with this design. After all, if the king would reside here on his royal tours, he and his family would need the best protection the castle could offer, and his retinue would need the same. But finally, York Castle has gone from being a wooden anachronism from the 11th century to a sturdy structure of stone of the 13th. As for this door, it is inaccessible to the public, and I don't know what lies beyond. Though I'm assuming there would be a kitchen somewhere, as it is doubtful the kitchen would be on the upper floor.
Hey there!
And even though there would have been kitchens in the bailey, it is doubtful they would cook the food there and drag it all the way here. So there must have been a kitchen. At the very least, a pantry. Either way, the ground floor would be pretty busy at a focal point of the keep. I'm wondering, do these doors lead to the same place, the same room? And was there a dividing panel in between? Would certainly make sense. I don't see any evidence of fittings, but something must have been there. Of course, back in those days, you wouldn't have been able to look up to the top like we can now, as there would have been a wooden ceiling. A high one, but a ceiling nonetheless, forming the base of the upper floor which houses the king's solar, his private quarters. So down here on the ground floor, it's going to be a lot darker than it is now. Certainly less lit than we are used to, but in those days, your eyes would get used to it. There'd be lots of candles, you can see lots of windows, plus that large roaring fire. All of a sudden, this cold ruined building feels like it would have been quite cosy, even by our standards. A nice ambience of candlelight and hearth, and warm, despite the lack of glass in the windows. Would they have had shutters and drapes? Food for thought. The upper floor would have been supported by pillars, accessed by one of the spiral staircases. This is the king's solar, where he and his family live during their visits. Again, you can see where the wooden panels would have divided the sections of this floor. And there's even a guardrobe, a medieval toilet, situated in the wall. And there's another one on the roof terrace. Knowing that there would have been a floor here, most likely covered in rugs, you can just imagine living there. From the warmth of the fireplace, you can just imagine people sitting at the windows, gazing out over the city of York. I would have loved to have seen this castle in its heyday, see the hustle and bustle, what went on behind the scenes that remain unwritten, the meetings, the banquets, the arguments. We know that York Castle was where Henry III spent Christmas in the winter of 1251, when he gave away his daughter Margaret's hand in marriage to the King of Scotland, Alexander III. They were both only around 10 years old at the time, married for political reasons. And the young Scottish king would remain at the castle until January, before heading back up to Edinburgh. The Scottish kings would have been familiar with York, having stayed here on many occasions, often in times of tension, often in times of peace. And to think that this betrothal was designed to help relations between the two kingdoms, given that Margaret's brother, Edward, would one day become the Hammer of Scots. But before we move on with the history of the castle, there are still some parts left unexplored. We've not seen the chapel, nor the roof terrace. So, let's press on. Some parts were made of stone, like the staircases. You have the towers, and again you can see where the woodwork would have been. Spiral staircases are easily one of my favourite features of medieval buildings. Look at the spine of the stair, each step perfectly linked to the other, the finest precision. And you wind up the stair to get to the next floor.
Let's go into the chapel, shall we? I can take that out. And this is where the Lord's private chapel would have been, so let's explore.
One of the main features here, thankfully, survives: the King's private chapel. built in stone as part of the main structure. The chapel has everything you would need and is more spacious than it looks. Every time the king was here, this is where he'd visit. Every mass, every confession, all would be taken in this very room.
And the thing, King Henry III, this was his private chapel when he was here. It's fascinating. You know what? I can see the pub from here.
And take in mind, when I say private chapel, I'm referring to the fact that the castle belongs to the crown. It's, well, right now, Henry's castle. Hence the King's Tower. But private doesn't necessarily mean exclusive. Of course, when the king is here, this is where he and his family pray. But when he isn't here, somebody else will be keeping the seat warm, and they get to use the chapel too. Perks of the job and all. Plus, anyone who has been given the privilege. People might be visiting. There might be a magnate. And why not? I mean, it wouldn't be the Middle Ages without a little bit of nepotism. Anyway, I hear this place is a nice roof terrace, so up we go. All these stairs. I'm up and down like Tower Bridge. But hey, at least I'm getting exercise. Thankfully, there are rails and walkways due to modern health and safety, which is much appreciated here in this ruin. Though it was windy and I almost lost my hat, and there's Buckley's chance of me retrieving it should it fall. Anyway, here you can look out over the city of York and the surrounding areas. You can see for miles. Perfect for noticing the enemy on the horizon. And, in case of rain, the keep would have had a conical sloped roof to protect it, rather than let the water flood the floors below. And, if you need to do your proper, there's a guardrobe up here too. Though all that's left is a rusty grill, and I can't imagine the staff being too chuffed if anybody used it. During this period, more and more prisoners are being housed in the jail in the Bailey. Around 300 people, crammed into such a small space. This isn't a modern-day prison either. This is a medieval dungeon with appalling living conditions. The mortality rate was high. As time presses on, you are slowly seeing a divide between the castle and the Bailey itself, which has long been replaced by the old debtors' prison, the women's prison, and the Crown Court. And even they're no longer in use. Well, the Crown Court is, but the prisons are now museums. Eventually, it'll stop being a Motte and Bailey castle, and as the two elements take their separate paths through history. That done, I'll head back down the winding stairs to the ground floor. This castle was a multi-storey grand affair, worthy of the 13th century. And it wasn't just the keep that got a makeover. The curtain wall was rebuilt, again in stone, complete with towers and a gatehouse. Very impressive. And the King's Tower would dominate the city, lording it over the other buildings, alongside York Minster, another building that is relatively new to the period, having been built on the ruins of the old one 20 odd years back. But right now, in the 13th century, it is a modern bailey, and soon the crown passes from Henry III to his eldest son, Edward I, otherwise known as Longshanks. Although he seems to have relied on the sheriffs of Yorkshire to keep things running, himself focusing on the campaigns in Wales, beginning a new phase of castle building, far greater buildings and more complex than the King's Tower at York. During his wars with the Scots, he most certainly would have resided at York on his journeys to and fro. His quarrel with William Wallace, making legend in both kingdoms. And soon Longshanks would quarrel with Robert the Bruce, focusing everything towards the north. And it is Edward I who leads the kingdom into the 14th century. However, like the grandfather he never knew, the elderly king falls ill of dysentery while travelling to Scotland, passing away in Cumberland. The Hammer of the Scots passed his crown to Edward II. Now, during Edward II's reign, the castle is more frequently being associated with the Exchequer and the law courts, and other local buildings had to be commandeered in order to cope with the overspill from the Bailey jail. And when the Knights Templar are persecuted in 1307, many of them end up incarcerated in the York's Castle Bailey. Quite the turnaround, given the local mills were under the control of the Templars. Now the Crown controls the lot. Right, up until now, you were probably wondering why on earth I named the castle Clifford's Tower at the beginning, while I keep calling it the Heist Tower or the King's Tower. After all, it belongs to the Crown and no magnates possess it, let alone a magnate called Clifford. So what on earth is going on? Right, I'll address that. You see, Edward II is less than popular, doting all his attention to his favourite, Gaveston. He even alienates his queen, Isabella of France. And yes, there is a lot of speculation about his homosexuality. Whatever the case, soon Gaveston is murdered and the king picks another favourite, Hugh Despenser. Swiftly, the magnates are turning against the king, heading towards a civil war. This is the Despenser War, as the two most powerful men in the kingdom, Despenser and Mortimer, ramp up their hostilities into open battle. The problem was, Hugh Despenser was the king's favourite. He's got so much power. He's king in all but name. So Mortimer, by declaring war on Despenser, has declared war on the king. But hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and the she-wolf of France, Isabella, sides with Mortimer. One of the barons that opposed the king was Roger de Clifford, the Lord of Skipton. Less than 10 years prior, his father had died at the Battle of Bannockburn. And in 1321, Clifford had sided with the Earl of Lancaster, one of Mortimer's men, and was there when Lancaster laid siege to Tick Hill Castle. The siege did not go well and ended in a royal victory. There's more bad news, as two of the rebel leaders, Mortimer and Humphrey de Bourne, the Earl of Hereford, are forced to head to Wales to put down a peasant revolt, in the Welsh marshes. They're effectively out of the war. This leaves only Lancaster to fight the king who heads north. And Edward would have stopped in York, sending his man Harclay, the Sheriff of Cumberland, to cut off Lancaster at nearby Boroughbridge, which is only around 17 miles away. The Dispenser War was decided there and then in 1322, March the 16th, at the Battle of Boroughbridge, when the two armies clashed. Commanding one of the rebel columns, Roger Clifford tried to push his forces over the bridge, but Harclay was a veteran of the Scottish Wars and had adopted the Schiltron formation, nullifying Clifford's advance. In this battle, longbows were used heavily. As the rebels tried to push across the bridge, some of Harclay's spearmen went under the bridge and thrust their spears up into the Earl of Hereford's bum,
Ooh, right up the jacksie.
killing him. In the chaos that followed, Clifford was also injured and the battle was won by the royals. Here, Roger de Clifford was captured and taken to York Castle, where he was executed by being hung in chains until dead. It is a possible reason why this is known as Clifford's Tower. Maybe a bit fanciful, because would the execution of a magnate change the nickname of the castle? More likely it's because a family called Clifford end up running the castle later. But you never know. Less than 5 years later, Edward II is overthrown, as Isabella openly supports the rebels, called the Contrarians, and calls upon her brother, Charles the Fair of France, to invade England. They do. Hugh Despenser is captured, then hung, drawn and quartered. Things have really escalated. Before long, the king is imprisoned and dies soon after. Some say with red-hot poker up his bum. Other sources say not. There's a lot more to it than this, but this is the gist of what's going on, rather than the fine details. So Mortimer and Isabella are now in charge, but they don't get to rule for very long, as her son has Mortimer executed, and he takes the crown that is rightfully his. Right, so Edward III is now on the throne. Again, that's the gist. There's a lot more details to it than this. But this is supposed to be about York Castle, not the whole of English history. Anyway, there is further divide between the keep and the bailey. On one hand, you have a military garrison, complete with water mills and a royal mint. On the other hand, literally just down the road, you have a prison full of scallywags in for all sorts of crimes, from legal to political. And even the keep itself was used now and then for execution. It has long ceased being a royal residence. Repairs and maintenance are infrequent, and by the 15th century, the keep has fallen into disrepair and neglect. The only one truly caring about the castle was Richard III, but he's killed at Bosworth before he can fully restore the castle, managing to pull down a few decaying structures, but not getting the chance to rebuild them. By Edward VI, even the mint was derelict. By the 16th century, the old mills were sold off to private holders, leaving the crown. Eventually, the Earl of Cumberland, the Clifford family, took possession of the keep itself by a lease, leading to the other reason the keep was given its moniker, Clifford's Tower, as the Clifford family now resides there. During the Tudors, the tower fell into further disrepair, and the stonework of the old castle was gradually sold off. The walls have gone, etc., and decaying buildings were rebuilt. The tower itself was almost pulled down, but an attempt was made by the locals to prevent it. Thankfully. Under James I, the tower's leasehold was sold on to two private owners, Babington and Dunfield. They then sell it on to somebody else, so we're already getting a picture that the castle's being passed around like a football, from one person to the other. Eventually, the castle is back in hands of the Cliffords, and when civil war broke out in 1642, Henry Clifford garrisons the castle under command of King Charles, and makes extensive repairs to the castle keep. But he dies a year later, in 1643. With Clifford gone, the king places the Earl of Newcastle, also a royalist, in control of York, which is now called the capital of the North. And when he, that is Newcastle, heads north to face the invading Scots, he leaves John Bellasyse in charge, who is promptly made the governor of the city. In 1644, the Parliamentarian forces lay siege to the city, which raged on from late April to early June, the besieged royal forces finally getting relief when Prince Rupert drives off the Roundhead attackers. Alas, it was a hollow victory, and without proper support, the royalists were forced into retreat, abandoning York, with Newcastle declaring that the whole war effort was futile and choosing exile. It was the death knell for the royalist cause, and soon Prince Rupert is utterly defeated at the Battle of Marsden Moor. Having won the siege and taken over the city, Parliament appointed Thomas Dickinson, a local merchant, to act as the governor of the castle. He kept the position until the Restoration. With the Battle of Naseby, the war was over, and soon the king was beheaded. This leaves Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector of the realm. In 1650, Cromwell is in York, receiving a gun salute from the cannons atop Clifford's Tower. He even stationed a garrison there, although charged the city for the privilege. When Cromwell died, monarchy was restored, and Charles II is king. Thus the old castle keep is passed back to the crown. Thomas Dickinson hands it back over to the Cliffords. Though I will mention that the Clifford family are no longer earls by this time, the last chap being the last. They are just another regular wealthy family in the north. As for the keep itself, it is a far cry from the once royal residence, enjoyed by kings of old, the likes of John and Henry. Now just a decrepit stone building from yesteryear, passed from leaseholder to leaseholder. The only real break being when Charles II stations his own garrison at the keep, so blocking the leaseholders from doing anything with it. After all, it's still controlled by the crown. Disaster struck in 1684 on St George's Day that year. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, there was a terrible explosion as the munitions caught fire, apparently due to a gun salute on the roof. The explosion ripped through the inside of the tower, gutting it, wrecking the central pillar and bringing the roof down along with the second floor and everything. As I said, it was gutted. Ever since then, the castle's had a pink tinge. And miraculously, no one was injured. Yeah, about that. It turns out that the garrison had moved their belongings out of the keep. What a coinkydink! Highly suspicious. More like the people in the garrison, utterly fed up with the living conditions they had, which were very below par. There's been lots of complaints over the decades. Simply had enough and sabotaged it. The coup de grace and the end of Clifford's Tower. From then, it just lay in ruins. In the late 18th century, are those old water wheel mills? Well, they're rebuilt with the age of steam in mind. Noisy machines that not only polluted the area, but irritated the prisoners there. Conditions in the prisons were already terrible, and this only added to it. It was quite the scandal. Over the decades, there'd been many discussions about what to do with the place. In 1877, there were prison reforms, and the Prison Act was passed. Thus, the old jail was used as a county prison, put under the control of the government. But at the turn of the century, it ceased being a general prison, focusing on being a military prison instead, and the remaining prisoners were moved to Wakefield. Things were changing in general by this time. The steam mills that I described, well, they've been pulled down, and there were also alterations to the river fosse. Even the castle's moat had been drained and filled. As the 19th century came to a close, Clifford's Tower was declared a national monument, and in 1902, the decaying building underwent extensive repairs. It was soon open to visitors, and the structure beneath the gatehouse was stabilised with concrete. And by the 1960s, it had become part of the city proper. As for the prison bailey, in 1929, the old York prison finally shut its gates, and the old Tudor Victorian buildings were demolished 6 years later, leaving only the Crown Court, the debtors' prison and the female prison. The latter two serve as a museum. So, this building has seen quite a lot over the centuries, slowly falling to decay and neglect, until being finally ruined in a deliberate explosion. These days, the keep, known as Clifford's Tower, is a Grade 1 listed building managed by the English Heritage and open to the public. And I do advise everyone to visit this place if they can. It might not be much, but it is certainly worth the while. One of the many great things to do in this amazing city. Thank you for watching.